Bom, bem-vindos à quinta temporada do Tiaços. Quinta temporada, a gente está aqui desde 2020, então a gente está iniciando o nosso quinto ano de trabalho juntos, nessa comunidade que se formou em torno das ideias de compartilhar pesquisas e trabalhos do universo junguiano, pós-junguiano, arquetípico, de forma acessível para todos. Desde o nosso começo, em 2020, foram 120 encontros com pessoas de diversas partes do mundo que toparam compartilhar os seus conhecimentos de forma absolutamente gratuita. Nós temos um canal do YouTube. O nosso canal do YouTube tem, neste momento, a quantia de 2.800 inscritos e contém quase a totalidade dos nossos encontros. Mas eu quero deixar um recadinho aqui para vocês, que a gente precisa da participação de vocês aqui, agora, no local, para participação, para perguntas, para interlocução, e para que o projeto Tiaços continue existindo. Sejam todos bem-vindos e muito obrigada por estarem aqui. Agora eu vou falar da Susan, mas antes eu queria saber se o Marcos tem alguma colocação com relação ao nosso Tiaços. Marcos, quer falar alguma coisa?
Acompanho a relatora.
Bom, hoje a gente então recebe a Susan pela segunda vez. Susan Schwartz, ela esteve aqui em fevereiro de 2022, há exatamente 2 anos, quando ela apresentou o seu livro O Efeito da Ausência do Pai nas Filhas, Desejo Paterno, Ferida... Não, Desejo Paterno, Ferida Paterna, exatamente. Esse foi um encontro que reuniu um surpreendente número, foi quase o recorde de número de participantes no Tiaços, e rendeu um seminário que o Marcos Quintais coordena até hoje, que também é sucesso. Coordena pelo Lapa. Aliás, quem quiser se inscrever, que fique à vontade para falar com ele depois. Após esse primeiro encontro online com a Susan, eu tive o privilégio de conhecê-la pessoalmente no congresso da EAP. E a sua hospitalidade, simpatia e paciência com o meu inglês me impressionaram tanto quanto suas ideias compartilhadas em seu livro. Nesse encontro, ela gentilmente me convidou para ler e escrever uma recomendação em seu novo livro, que é o que ela vai apresentar hoje, coisa que eu aceitei prontamente, e o meu nome consta aqui na contracapa. E o livro se chama Síndrome do Impostor e a personalidade como ser na psicologia analítica, a fragilidade do self. É um livro profundo e, ao mesmo tempo, didático, que se utiliza de autores junguianos clássicos, pós-junguianos, estudiosos da psicanálise, da filosofia e da sociologia. Eu espero que vocês desfrutem. Eu vou dizer, então, para vocês o currículo da Susan. Ela é PhD, formada em Zurique, na Suíça, como analista junguiana. Também é psicóloga clínica e membro da Associação Internacional de Psicologia Analítica. Ela se apresenta em inúmeras conferências junguianas e programas de ensino nos Estados Unidos e no mundo. Susan tem artigos em diversas revistas e capítulos de livros sobre psicologia analítica junguiana. Seu livro Efeito da Ausência do Pai nas Filhas, Desejo Paterno, Ferida Paterna, foi traduzido para vários idiomas, inclusive português. Seu mais novo livro, também publicado pela Routledge, é intitulado, esse que eu acabei de ler para vocês, e sua prática clínica junguiana é desenvolvido em Paradise Valley, Arizona. E é isso. Depois ela tem um website que nós vamos deixar aí no chat para quem quiser visitá-lo. Susan, um prazer imenso te receber novamente aqui. Sinta-se à vontade, você já está na sua casa.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for attending. And I will begin with my screen sharing. 1 second. Can you see? Can you see it?
No, not yet.
No. Okay, wait, and just a moment. Let me get to it just for 1 second, all this arrangement. You can see it,
Yes.
but I want the whole screen. How's that?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Okay. So I want to quote a couple of pieces of literature first. When I suddenly see myself in the depths of the mirror, I take fright. I can scarcely believe I have limits, that I am outlined and defined. I feel myself to be dispersed in the atmosphere, thinking inside other creatures, living inside things beyond myself. When I suddenly see myself in the mirror, I'm not startled because I find myself ugly or beautiful. I discover, in fact, that I possess another quality. When I haven't looked at myself for some time, I almost forget that I am human. I tend to forget my past. And I find myself with the same deliverance from purpose and conscience as something that is barely alive. I am also surprised to find as I gaze into the pale mirror with open eyes that there is so much in me beyond what is known, so much that remains ever silent. That is from Clarice Lispector, Near to the Wild Heart. And a quote from Octavio Paz, Beyond myself, somewhere I wait for my arrival. And a story by Franz Kafka. To the doorkeeper, there comes a countryman who prays for admittance, but he is told he cannot be allowed in at the moment, maybe later. On this, the man stays until the end of his life. At that time, the doorkeeper says no one else was allowed in except the man, and now the door will be shut. The point of this story, called Before the Law, the point is that the man did not realize that the intangibility of what we confront stems not from its concealed essence, but from its very accessibility. This story and the other two quotes relate the very problem of the as-if person who does not realize about life, how to manifest what is theirs, and how to inhabit their essence. They don't tend to go through the door, as in the story, because they don't know their life is theirs. To further highlight the importance of this issue, in 2018, in Time magazine in the United States, published an article with an accompanying short video entitled, Yes, Imposter Syndrome is Real. Here is how to deal with it. The imposter, and what is here called the as-if personality, is defined by the central question, who am I really? The answer will reflect identity with goals, purposes, meanings in life, rather than the superficial answer to the superficial question, what is your name and where are you from? Identity in this more encompassing sense isn't fixed, handed down, or unconscious. Rather, it is something shaped and determined over time. A person's identity is a matter of what they are really about and is reflected in accessing the passions of life. The phrase as if can be characterized by the narcissism of facade, fragility, fraudulence, vulnerability, bounded by a wall of impenetrability. The person is veiled in an appealing but elusive persona based on a precarious sense of self. Distress occurs when the outer accomplishments formerly shoring up the personality are used up and the inner reserves collapse as they are no longer sustainable. The center cannot hold due to the lack of attachment at the core, creating part of the maladaptive life response. The energy is called inward to encounter what feels like a void. A man commented, "The mirror was in a space I had to walk past every day. Though I did not have to look in it, I did anyway, and didn't feel good in the mirror, regardless of how I looked. Every day I walked past that mirror, I looked at a man who was hurt and confused." This short statement is typical of the as-if personality. It reveals part of the complexity behind the adopted masks and illusions put forward by this personality type. The mask means hiding whoever wears it and disguising their identity as appearance and pretense establish a clear distinction between being and appearing. What is hidden and what is known? Unmasking is a metaphor for revealing an individual's identity, while the attempted dissimulation actively works to mystify and deceive oneself and others. This person has an impoverished and uncomfortable, emotionally and physically, relationship to the world although their presentation is of glitz and glamour. One is unable to bear, even momentarily, to be seen up close, beneath the skin. They might be perceived to be winners and having made it by others, but often are internally empty, disillusioned, anxious, confused, alienated, and most of all, estranged from themselves. Underlying is a sense of distrust and lack of confidence in one's place in the world. Filling the emptiness with people, places, and things attempts to compensate the feeling of being unreal. The emptiness arose from early emotional wounding and lack of correct or close enough attachment with consistent caregivers. As adults, these people become performers, needing attention, seemingly superficial. The question is posed about how to bridge the gap to access who one really is. The way of relating to the world is through mimicry and impostor facades, while the adaptation as if comes at the expense of authenticity. One feels as flat as the social media screen, yet they often hide this from themselves and others. The internal division signals being trapped in unconscious, personal, cultural, and historical wounds. These include unfinished mourning processes, intergenerational issues, and archetypal anxieties. The unconscious calls to be more deeply known, relationships with self and others open rather than closed, life no longer avoided with emotional distancing, compulsions, or perfectionism. This personality type, although clever at disguise, is swamped by emotional and psychological distress, haunted by aims and aspirations not yet achieved, along with the pressure of nothing ever being enough. These people defend against aspects of reality concerned with absence and loss that are felt to be intolerable. They need the illusions and idealizations of others focused on them so that life can seem other than it is. They construct a solid and tight package as a defense. In dreams, they might appear inappropriately dressed or insufficiently rehearsed because they don't feel ready for life. Jordan dreamt the following. I notice a small door at the bottom of my closet and realize it has been unlocked. I am worried that all this time I've been painstakingly locking the front and back doors of my apartment and didn't even know this door existed. It's a thin door that separates the wall of my unit to the hallway. I feel vulnerable and lock the door, but the lock is only a small hook latch and doesn't feel like it is strong enough to keep me safe. When it comes down to it, this personality type will put in much time to prepare and wish to perform, but often does not and backs off. He seems dreamlike, living as if, ethereal, and without feeling that he counts for much. Hurt, he tells no one the totality of what he wants or needs. And yet, he is bored by the daily grind and average because it is not exciting or glamorous. The fantasy world has brighter appeal, but also is never satisfied, and he always needs more. Jordan said, when I woke up the next day, I was faced with a mysterious door I didn't know or see previously. For Jung, this represented the encounter with the naked truth and was positive because the dark side is also part of the whole psyche. Nonetheless, the descent to the unconscious, as Jung said, is a narrow door whose constriction is painful. It is not easy to take off the mask and enter this terrain. The dream deeply stirred Jordan emotionally, awakening him to something forgotten or ignored. He was intrigued, but also scared, as he thought he had been careful and prepared, but he had missed this door. How did that happen? What did it represent? A single dream like this one, remarkable for its surprise, power, and simplicity, can completely change the mood and intentions for the day, week, and foreseeable future. As Andrew Samuels, British Jungian analyst, said, in analysis, the reflector is the dream, which can mirror psyche to reality and reality to psyche. As we spoke, Jordan realized he had been defended against aspects he considered shameful. What was excluded from consciousness was unconsciously holding him as a prisoner. This is indicated by the insecurely latched door. More upsetting, as he didn't even know about it. If locked, he felt safe, but now what? The dream draws Jordan to access personality pieces needed for the psyche to assist in achieving individuation and a deeper connection with life. The dream, positioned at the beginning of his analytical process, is actually leading him into himself. In fact, he has not formed a secure identity, making relationships to himself and to others a trail of confusing series of mishaps and poor choices. The behavior and the ways of relating might include aggressive and self-destructive elements, often hidden from the purview of others. Worried, he is behind and cannot catch up. He feels defeated and lost. In the need to be perfect and marvelous, he detests mediocrity, especially his own. Yet he becomes caught in negative thought cycles, self-denigrating to the point of paralyzing. In these cycles, he cannot find where he fits or what to develop. Due to the internal confusion and adaptation of mimicry and falsity take over, he becomes an impostor to himself. His inner discourse is composed of the selves he is not able to face as they lead to addressing the question, who am I? He was supposed to be someone, but not who he is. There are also various dissociations between mind and body as the personality is crumpled. The inner negative scrutiny makes reality disappointing and fraught with anticipated rejection. He's a spectator of life, keeps a distance from others, assuming they are smarter, more attractive, better. He feels separated by a thick curtain he cannot open. This a quote from Virginia Woolf, novelist in the mid-century in England. For there is nothing to lay hold of. I am made and remade continually. Different people draw different words from me. There has actually been a dearth of descriptors and serious attention to the as-if or imposter personality in the psychological literature. Many approaches center on how-to ideas for fixing behavior, but without attention to or inclusion of the unconscious. This reflects a lack of psychological depth or curiosity towards the intricacy of this personality type. The popularized term and descriptions of imposter syndrome does not adequately get at the depths applicable beyond the borders of culture, social class, status, or economics. Without the symbolic and the unconscious and delving into deeper meanings, the totality of a person is inadequately addressed, leaving one stuck in a quandary of pain and distress. Jung described this as follows: an inflated consciousness is always egocentric and conscious of nothing but its own existence. It is incapable of learning from the past, incapable of contemporary events, and incapable of drawing the right conclusions about the future. It is hypnotized by itself and therefore cannot be argued with. It inevitably dooms itself to calamities that must strike it dead. This is a personality trapped in the image, attempting the ideal without the ability to be one's individual or real self, rooted in the need for protection and self-reliance. The imposter shapeshifts the views of themselves to fit the occasion. An imposter does not feel a definitive identity and operates in the absence of a fully knowable self. These often highly achieving individuals apprehend they will be found out or unmasked as incompetent or unable. Success cannot be solidly achieved or maintained because the personality is weakened from within and the identity disjointed. They can look lively but feel lifeless as a mannequin. Each day, the question arises about which costume to put on. The costume represents an ego persona or outer image approach to life. The persona will appear intact, but underneath, the personality is in shreds. The need is to avoid the anxiety, loneliness, emotional losses, and the shadow perceived. The encounter with oneself effectively requires an encounter with one's shadow, in which, as Jung says, man stands forth as he really is and shows what was hidden under the mask of conventional adaptation. The retreat is from reality, so it does not have to be faced as one feels impotent to cope. The creation of these alternative worlds prevents access to the interior for the means of self-preservation. Identity shifts to please, stand out, or fit in, but basically to avoid depth and visibility. The real self has become unavailable, so busy complying with constraints imposed personally, culturally, socially. Whether noticed or not, this person remains hidden while in plain sight. The shadow of the impostor has taken over. Estranged from one's affective core, the loss of contact with an authentic self means closing away from others. An independent self or omnipotent self is convinced that it needs no others due to their perceived absence of safety. The self is felt as fragile and vulnerable, empty, dead, as if nothing was there. The inner darkness, the shadow, potential and energy lies secreted beneath the surface, making this person seem brittle, hollow, and false. Now a quote from an American writer, again of the 20th century, James Baldwin. This collision between one's image of oneself and what one actually is always very painful. And there are two things you can do about it. You can meet the collision head on and try and become what you really are, or you can retreat and try to remain what you thought you were, which is a fantasy, and in which you will certainly perish. The as-if personality was initially described by Freudian psychoanalyst named Helena Deutsch in 1942. But she described this person as without genuineness and basically imitative. In tracing the history of this psychological construct, there has been a lack of attention also in the psychoanalytic literature. The original description portrays a person with impoverished or absent emotional relationship towards both inner and outer worlds. Deutsch tended to dismiss this personality as only superficial, an imposter type, and without depth. However, Hester Solomon, British Jungian analyst, discovered there is a genuineness that lay hidden within the sorrows and traumas remaining. A depth of emotional lack and grief existed under the facade. The adaptation through mimicry is desperately constructed to obfuscate and defend against being known. And I would add, the desire is to be known. The as-if person often feels divided within and cut off from the deeper aspects of the self. especially from the bodily experience. One's behavior turns destructive, indicating being at odds with oneself. Not registering basic body needs or treating the body as a distant object, the body self becomes disjointed. Life is like hanging on a thread, a knot in the throat. Frantic, they will not get whatever they are after, hounded by insecurities. Such people keep themselves together through routines and schedules to follow, rather than relying on their natural instincts. One is easily decentered, ungrounded. With any hint of negativity, and in sorrow, one may begin to withdraw and create facades to protect so no one can perceive the real self. Unconsciously, one becomes subsumed in the separation from any authenticity. The self becomes constructed by eradicating any blemish or problem and hiding the shadow aspects. The fabrication is an artifice of image as the real recedes to the sidelines. Attention remains between the public and the private self. Another quote from Jung: "If it were only resistance that he felt, it would not be so bad. In actual fact, however, the psychic substratum, that dark realm of the unknown, exercises a fascinating attraction that threatens to become all the more overpowering the further that one penetrates into it." One of the hallmarks of the as-if personality is perfectionism. Anything is excluded that might displease, and one aims to avoid whatever could be interpreted as discordant or misshapen. This person is lured by the relief of fantasy, creates images, ideas, events to cover over the assumed personality flaws. There is much shame and panic to be hidden and denied. Striving to be perfect, adopting a persona of confidence and surety, one becomes false. Perfection is never satisfied and inevitably turns destructive. Nothing and no one are good enough or last long enough. The good easily dissipates in each next endeavor needed to prop up the personality. This way of thinking and perceiving the world occurs when one grows up without a foundation of support, safety, or sufficient nurturing. It can be a reaction to childhood trauma, cultural expectations, or unconsciously reactive to transgenerational issues. Appearing perfect becomes a strategy to emotionally survive and cope with the lingering distrust in the environment, self, and others. The gnawing emptiness signals of the lack of a secure identity. One is always uneasy, needs validation and positive evaluation by others. One must be stellar and without any issues, or there is the crush of despair and defeat. The sense of solid identity is easily jeopardized in the anticipated abandonment for any infraction and assessed as doing poorly. This reaction is unloaded without the reserves or the defense to make it through. Self-negating thoughts and actions are set up against the imagined standards of perfection. And the original losses while escaping introspection Relationships are based on disguise and learned inauthenticity, although social and with the expected presentation, seemingly capable of warmth. Emotional depth is stunted, and the person feels unable to emerge or to be safely seen. There is also the issue of self-hatred, indicating a basic division between the ego and self when the spontaneous being of the person is hated, feared, and attacked. The frantic need is to avoid the impact of the shame and self-hatred, and it is not easily eradicated. Hatred is paradoxical. It emerges from traumatic origins and involves primitive defense mechanisms of the self, but it manifests itself at a sophisticated level of consciousness where ego fragments have coalesced, albeit in a distorted way, to form into a fixed complex. In other words, hatred of oneself, driven by perfectionism, causes one to become frozen and separated from within. Culturally, social media and superficial focus represents a lack of the search for knowing oneself. Identity cannot be found behind the masks of social media. Mounting disruption set in place for the social. This is a impersonation dependent on the judgment of others. Hope is offered. Instead, the false self and shell of persona houses the personality. He then picks up an identity for a while, becoming it temporarily. She becomes the face of the one she imagines looking at her. Aiming to be a media queen means packaging herself to be cloaked in facade. The facade makes it seem like she is there when she really is not. But where is she? Airbrushed, tinted, trimmed, reshaped, leading to hide the search for self-legitimization. These people are maintained through split selves, partially engaged in relationships, but remaining emotionally hidden, mostly to themselves, unable to commit or find their depth, meaning, or fulfillment. The talents are there. The dedication to their individuality is curtailed. Little remains of the intimate and private when in social media. It also arouses a sense of isolation as the virtual substitute for a person-to-person contact. Contact with the world is feigned, and there's no real personal or touchable, and too much becomes reduced to the general or trivial as appearance substitutes for being. The reality of emotions seems muted or wildly uncensored. The passion for self-exposure is stylized then for popular consumption. The portrayals, whether true or not, make it seem the idealized and the image is what is sought and lauded. The attempt is to maintain fascination, yet there remains remoteness, and that does not bring the real person near. If the real ego is too weak and living the masks of the false self, then how can one begin to integrate the shadow? Another quote, this from Susan Sontag, 20th century American writer. Monstrous living body, the slumbering giant that wakes, vomiting destruction, and then sinking back into somnolence, flushes the marrow out of your bones and topples your soul. The as-if person reenacts aggression against the original lost object as they turn animosity toward themselves. Other descriptors of this type of personality are in a state between what they fear in their own minds and what they fear in the outside world. This is an impoverishment of the self and is attributed to the experiences with the Lord and idea. However, when the parental figure is too distant, a person can become inhibited, frightened, unable to access healthy assertion. This derives from a lifelong script of inferiority and aggression turned inward, caught in self-deception while debasing the self. And this is a quote from Jung. Children are so deeply involved in the psychological attitude of their parents that it is no wonder that most of the nervous disturbances in childhood can be traced back to a disturbed psychic need for the agents to compensate the want and adaptation to the outer world. The as-if personality internalized the absence, the emptiness, lifeless void, and blank experience that is without access to the true self. I'm going to skip Isa to page 16. And a quote from Hegel: self-consciousness is faced by another self-consciousness. It has come out of itself. As if people are known to develop pseudo-contacts, substituting for real feelings with others. They behave as if they have emotional relations, but the emotions cannot get through to the real, as this means sharing who one is and revealing true opinions. Too often, concern about the consequences of speaking up leave them without their voice. They might even be described as frigid, meaning avoiding emotions, hiding their insufficiencies, behaving woodenly, as if they had real feelings and genuine contact with people. An example is a woman named Immani, who dreamt of a series of women in a pop-up grid on a pornography internet website. She then saw herself in a house that she was in a small, and this scene reads itself over and over. In the next minute, in the next image popping up, she is alone in an even smaller grid or house, and there is no obvious way in or way out. What does this dream mean? It describes that she is encased in a box or a flat square while the faces get smaller and she becomes increasingly enclosed, unable to relinquish the illusion of safety in the way things were or are, imprisons and creates a death in life existence. The dream scene takes place on a porn site, and she is imprisoned in something sexual, but disconnected and enclosed in the box. And the options concerning as being objectified by herself. And she is alone in the image, even though it begins with other women also encapsulated, each in a square and not in communication with each other. These could be also appearing in a isolated box, closed, linear, and mechanically driven. But by what part of her? Jacqueline Rose, British writer and thinker, commented on this. What classical cinema performs or puts on stage is this image of woman as other, dark continent, and from there, what escapes of it is lost to the system. At the same time, as sexuality is frozen into her body as spectacle, the object of phallic desire and or identification. Here the body expresses distance, disconnect, behind the sexuality set to gain attention. Of psychic deadness and impacting one's relationship to the world. Disturbance in body ownership and body image. The body is objectified and at cross purposes with the need for the sense of oneself as found through the physical. As her dream portrays, Immani's body is used as an object to keep people away. She walks around wanting to be noticed, better than others, thinner, appearing younger, smarter. No matter what, she is primarily focused on getting attention, but it must be at a distance. She is cognizant that no one knows the real her, and she is content with this, but also at times becomes very, very lonely. This is a talented woman, intellectually gifted, highly articulate, quick to respond and rebuff. She uses thoughts and words as weapons to defeat and remain removed from others. Quiet in the analytical sessions rarely occurs, as if any potentially reflective space will fill with what she doesn't want to know, doesn't know, or doesn't want to know. She allows little room for commentary, as if she must defend against any surprises or enter the unfamiliar to avoid the critique she cannot tolerate. This indicates a fragile and fearful ego and a person who is defended against her own depth. In analysis, she develops a fusion-like mode of relating, unable to tolerate the space between herself and myself. She denies any separateness, creating an imagined sameness between us. To feel safe and unthreatened by any other, the reality of the connection between two separate people must be resisted. She does not take in information and defends against any additional commentary to her story. Relationship means taking the other in, being seen and vulnerable, but this can be overlaid with shame. She enacts what is called a manic defense, meaning denying the increasing awareness of limitation, loss, ambivalence, and complexity. It is a defense against the fear of destroying the object, meaning the other, and subsequently the self. Immani has no room for the interactive, no pause to allow different reactions. There's no ability to allow for the smallness necessary to take in new information and to just not No. Any understanding countered by its opposite to her means rejection, so she defends and pushes away. In this, Immani seems omnipotent and in need of no one else, alone as in the box in the dream. Isa, I'm going to skip to the bottom of 23. Immani became a femme fatale, an anima woman, posing, not really knowing love, just garnering attention. All this hid her anxiety about physical and psychological appearance, feeling fragile and vulnerable in the presence of others. In the confrontation with otherness, she becomes entangled in desire and lack, and this initiates a skirmish for recognition. The as-if person quickly intuits their own deficiency, one-sidedness, singularity, threat, and it seems there is something which, although it belongs to its own essence, it lacks. The psyche looks to complete itself, to manifest in higher modes of consciousness. The process begins with reflection, time, and inner examination, circling around to find herself. The quest for fulfillment is an organic development and relational process, making sense of the losses, yearning, needs, anxieties. However, Immani pulls away. There is a sense of immobility, powerlessness, while the refusal of togetherness is defensive and stagnates attempts to engage with adverse thoughts and isolates her from a range of affects. She had an impaired ability to symbolize, with recall of very few dreams and a cavalier attitude about their value. It seemed the uncontrolled information was not to be trusted and the unknown backed away from. She refused to be disturbed by desire, as the world needed to be smooth and predictable. Immani remained like her dream of being in the box on the pornography site. She wanted to know a bit of herself, but not too much. It was just so she could procure the right words and sound psychologically aware. Would she continue the facade? She kept having one facelift after the other, looking more and more false, signaling increasing distance from self. Perhaps the emptiness has become too solidly internalized. Will she ever allow the curiosity about who she is? It seemed not yet. And a quote from Jung: if a man embraces his wholeness, he can avoid the unhappy consequences of repressed individuation. He continues, if he voluntarily takes the burden of completeness on himself, he need not find it happening to him against his will in a negative form. I go back to the first person I spoke about, Jordan. Jordan dreamt that he was on a beach and 3 men in black capes with a flock of blackbirds behind them walked past him. One of the men laid a book with the cover decorated in jewels and the pages in an old manuscript style. When he looked up the image online, he found it was an alchemical codex from the Middle Ages. What is this? These are powerful images to play with and unravel, taking him into the mystery of himself However, he did not yet appreciate the wealth of his psyche or the depth of understanding that he could acquire. He did not yet realize the value of the codex or the knowledge it contained as it appeared in his dream. Yet, he knew the appearance of this dream symbol was important and could lead him farther into his self. Self and world are disjointed for the as-if person. Bewildered, where do they turn? This person is often misread, not understood, and in need of gaining access to their inner world. The point of Jungian work and the challenge of the as-if personality is to find security and the uniqueness of self, including establishing genuine relationships with others. The as-if fragmentation and disunion then function as opportunities to discover unique repatternings. Jungian analytical psychology, with its use of symbols, dreams, and exploring meaning in the psychological complexes, invites the quest through the personal and collective stories connecting to oneself and others. There is a gap for the as-if personality between who one is and who one wants to be. This creates an endless series of painful recreations of past troubles and rigid limiting behaviors and attitudes, and it is the very place of the opening to the personality. Analytical psychological treatment is a place where the chaos and the anxieties absorbed from childhood can become thinkable. The search is for the underlying order, the connections to the self. The hope under all the defenses and layers is to accept the vulnerability, fragility, but at the same time, enable belief in and support for the future. Finally, accessing this, Jordan expressed the following. I feel for years, I built up this protection around me. I was always on the fence, and life was like walking or running on a minefield, and you never knew when the mine would explode. But now I feel like I'm walking without looking down. I feel like I'm open. I was raised to never show weakness, but no longer must accept living like that. And I close with a quote from Rilke. We discover, indeed, that we do not know our part. We look for a mirror. We want to rub off the makeup and remove the counterfeit and be real. But somewhere, a bit of memory still sticks to us that we forget. So thank you. Let me go out of my screen and we will see if there are any comments.
Susan, super obrigada, que apresentação potente. Eu imagino que despertou um monte de dúvidas e comentários aí. Enquanto as pessoas se organizam para me perguntar, por favor, perguntem, coloquem seus nomes no chat, que eu vou chamando vocês. Eu queria te dizer assim, que eu fiquei com uma impressão, Susan, da dificuldade que é a gente receber pacientes ou tratar nossa própria síndrome do impostor, sendo que um dos tipos, pelo que eu entendi, um dos tipos de cura é ir ao encontro da sombra, né? E justamente o que esta personalidade faz é esconder a sombra, né? Esconder porque tem vergonha, tem pânico da sombra. Então, como é que nós vamos acessar essa sombra se essa pode ser a defesa que está segurando o ego inteiro? Como não fragmentar a pessoa? Como é que a gente pode ter certeza que a pessoa não vai surtar se a gente entrar em contato com isso. E junto com essa pergunta, eu queria que você me dissesse, eu usei uma palavra,
Oh,
até na hora que eu...
well, yes, great. You have many questions within there. So let me just
Ok.
see where I go and tell me if I answer your commentary. How we access the shadow is through actually the analytical or therapeutic relationship. If the damage happened in relationship, it is relationship that heals the damage. And I also think there is something about the acceptance of the analyst or the therapist of the person as they are with their facade and holding that and then being able to, over time, I think over time is a key, being able to over time accompany the person into themselves. I think it takes encouragement. I oftentimes will ask people, what is their dream? Or what did they not talk about in the last session? What are they hiding? So I bring the shadow out because for me, it holds, not just for me, it holds the richness of the personality. And I see quite a few people who will come in, even on the first session. I am a fraud. I know nobody knows me. And from that, we can really develop, because I will ask, how do you know that? How do you perpetuate that? How do you act that way here between us? So that's why I say, what are you hiding? Let's look at it. And I think our responsibility as therapists and analysts is to be able to accept whatever comes. And that's the shadow. And in the shadow are amazing stories, some horrifying, some you can't even believe it, some you're appalled by, but they require and are helped by our reaction with the person. One other thing, that this personality type develops from a childhood of not being seen. So if they come to us and they feel seen and they can share even a little bit of what they think is awful, then the little bit gets bigger and bigger. And again, the personality then becomes stronger. It is not that these people are unable. It is that they didn't learn how. There wasn't a space to learn how to be who they are as people. And so if we provide that space relationally, and not easy, but if we take care of ourselves and make sure that we are on top of who we are, then it makes it easier. I think there's one other thing we could ask, which is, why has this become more prevalent? Are we paying more attention to it? Is there something about our cultures, our era, that is perpetuating this? I have to ask all of you as well, because I live in the United States, where to me, this is very prevalent. But I don't think it's only related to one country. I think because it is a personal issue, family issue. Also, I mentioned intergenerational. You know, how many people through generations learn to hide? Don't feel good about yourself. Don't put yourself out there. And we want to be able to correct that as well. A long answer.
Ótimo. Imagina. Quando eu li a primeira vez o seu texto, eu fiquei com uma impressão muito reconfortante, eu diria, de que tem um prognóstico possível, assim, de cura. Essa foi a palavra que me veio. Eu não lembro nem se você usa essa palavra no livro, mas para mim, me soou como uma possibilidade de cura. Eu queria que você falasse um pouquinho sobre o que você pensa sobre a palavra cura e sobre a possibilidade de cura nessa personalidade.
So if we expand the word cure to say acceptance of oneself, not in a defeated way, but this is who I am in a I'm okay way. And do we really, I mean, it's a question to ask. Do we get cured of who we are, or do we expand into all that we are? And so you're right. I did never use the word cure because I think it's actually almost harder to expand than or maybe cure is a part of the expansion. Because I always think that people come wanting to be more of who they really are. I mean, I think that's the desire, to be more of who they really are. And too often we have been told either we can't or there is a limit. So the cure would be push out of that narrow envelope. Become who you are. I mean, isn't it interesting that Jung calls it the process of individuation? It doesn't mean that you're, just by yourself. It means you're a solid self opening to the solidity of the world and being able to withstand the vicissitudes of the world.
Ótimo. Excelente. Bom, temos uma pergunta já aqui, que é a da Tarsila. Tarsila, por favor, quer fazer sua pergunta?
Boa tarde. Olá, Susan. Eu fiquei um pouco surpresa, porque quando eu escutei o título, na minha expectativa, a gente ia conversar um pouco sobre um pouco da síndrome do impostor que tem em cada um de nós. E você trouxe como uma personalidade em si. Eu não tinha pensado, não conhecia isso como uma personalidade em si. Então, se você puder, o que eu gostaria que você comentasse um pouquinho é esse pedacinho da síndrome do impostor que tem em todos nós, no fim das contas. Porque todos nós temos um tal de ideal de ego ideal, e do que a gente luta para conquistar uma tal perfeição, ilusória, com certeza, e como a gente vai trabalhando nisso. Mas eu vejo em mim e vejo em alguns dos meus pacientes que eles trabalham sim a sombra, eles trabalham os incômodos, mas de quando em quando vem, poxa, eu me sinto uma impostora ali, ou no trabalho, eu tenho medo de ser descoberta, de que eu não sei fazer. E nesse contexto, não me dá a impressão de que é uma personalidade como ser, que é como você trouxe, né? E sim momentos de insegurança, talvez, do paciente, em alguma situação que ele precisa se expor mais. Então, se você puder comentar um pouquinho nesse sentido, eu agradeço.
Well, I also would have to ask a question to your question, which is that isn't a personality type, doesn't that imply that there is a preponderance of certain qualities? So we all have times where we put on a facade, where we are being fake, not totally real, times. But there are people who can't take the mask off because they are afraid. It's an amount of these qualities that make it into a certain personality type and influence one's view of the world, of themselves, how they act in relationships, how honest they are. I mean, we all can tend to be less than wonderful. But the people that I'm talking about have a preponderance of these qualities, and they are limiting. See, this is the issue. They are limiting their development. Because if you spend a lot of energy hiding, where do you have energy to come forward? And I also think that it has been underestimated the seriousness of this kind of person, because they oftentimes are put down as a superficial kind of nothing in a way. And that isn't true. That isn't true. So I think there's something about really honoring the struggle to come alive that is really indicative to me of this personality type. And I call it also a personality type. I mean, it's just me, but I see the amount of people that I see in my practice. It's not 10,000, but there's a lot. And so many that you would not consider imposter type or feeling fraudulent. They're accomplished. They do wonderfully, but they don't. Inside, they don't. They know what is wrong. And if you ask them, they will tell you, yes, I am flawed. I've always been flawed. Nobody knows it. I cover it up. And in that is the pain of what we want to address. So I think that because it's a deal, it's a personality type, is what I would say. One other thing I wanted to add, and that is that in my presenting, I want to be very clear. I'm not talking about the fact that I'm not eliminating the fact that we all have aspects of this inside of ourselves. The question is, what is the extent? And is it limiting us or not? So there's the difference. I think putting people as certain types can be limiting if we segment people or diagnose them or put them in a negative category. And I am not meaning that at all. I really want to accentuate the potential that occurs once the personality gets lifted from carrying its heavy burden of needing to hide and feeling vulnerable.
Ótimo. Obrigada, Tarsila. Me parece que a Ana Cristina queria fazer um complemento dessa questão. Ana Cristina, quer falar o que você pensou?
Boa tarde para todos. Enquanto a nossa palestrante estava expondo, ficou me vindo a palavra merecimento, porque às vezes aparece isso, né? Essa impostura como sendo um sentimento de não merecer, ou eu não fiz o suficiente, ou eu não... Até socialmente falando, um aspecto da sociedade, eu não sofro tanto quanto aquele fulano, então eu não mereço o que eu tenho. Se essa síndrome conversa um pouco com isso. Essa é a minha pergunta. Obrigada.
The problem is the imposter does not dialogue with all the parts of themselves inside. Yes. And if you are not dialoguing with and including all the personality parts, you will feel worthless. That is true. Low self-esteem, worthless, energy depleted, and I would also say this manifests not just psychologically, but physically. I quite want to emphasize that because people can walk around and they might look fine, but inside in their own body, they feel worthless. They feel badly. And I think as analysts and therapists, if we don't bring in the body and talk about how people are in relationship to their body, how they treat themselves, then we are jumping over and not attending to a significant place where people feel worthless. So, yes, you brought forward a very important piece. We could also say that how do we get to expand the personality unless we feel worthy? And where do we learn worthlessness? Maybe in the family, maybe between siblings. It's not just parents. Maybe it's between siblings. Maybe it is in the culture. Maybe it is in the family background. Maybe it is in the generations, feeling worthless. People carry this. You know, it can be also a non-verbal impression that we learn when we are young to not be. It's quite deadly, especially when it's not verbal. People will say, I just learned it. Where? Just learned it. And that's unconscious also. Who is being protected if you're not being all of yourself? Who are you protecting? It really becomes a circular look at all the aspects that we get exposed to. It's not just family, again. It is also culture. It is also the other people that we know. It's also colleagues. It's ubiquitous. Huh? Worth is very important. Yeah.
Ótimo. Obrigada, Ana Cristina. Pati, sua vez, vai lá. Tá com o microfone fechado, querida.
Desculpa, assim não dá para ouvir. Oi, Susan, obrigada. Achei interessante essa personalidade do impostor como uma personalidade sustentada pela persona, né? Como se fosse uma casa com uma fachada bem bonita, mas sem móvel, né? Era uma casa, não tinha teto, não tinha nada, como diz uma música aqui no Brasil. Mas um pouco perto do que a Ana Cristina estava falando, eu também entendia a síndrome do impostor, que chama bastante atenção no relato de alguns pacientes, com uma dificuldade muito grande de se apropriar das próprias qualidades. E é algo que beira quase um narcisismo, numa proteção de não acreditar no que o outro está dizendo. Eu estou chamando de narcisismo porque são pessoas que recebem feedbacks positivos, que são avaliadas de uma forma boa no trabalho ou avaliadas pelos seus pares de forma elogiosa, mas não se sentem identificados com aquele elogio, não conseguem de forma alguma assimilar. E por que eu estou chamando de narcisismo? Porque eu achei interessante quando você citou o Jung falando que eles são inconscientes, a consciência inflada é inconsciente da sua própria existência, fica hipnotizada por si mesma. Eu achei que essa definição do Jung muito se assemelha a este tipo de sensação de impostor, porque fica tão ensimesmado que não consegue absorver esse elogio do outro, né? Então, eu fui fazendo essas associações e pensando que se além da sombra também não há uma dificuldade de ver uma luz. em si próprio, né? Se não há uma dificuldade, o que a Ana Cristina chamou talvez de merecimento, de se perceber essa pessoa bacana, né? E a fala do outro é completamente invalidada.
You're absolutely correct. In the book, I do have a chapter on narcissism because narcissism is an aspect of this, and this is an aspect of narcissism. So both ways. But the problem also is what you had said. There's a singularity which refuses the other. And this is, of course, typical of narcissism. But it defends against not only the others outwardly, but it defends against the others inwardly. And here we have, I mentioned it, self-hatred. So the hatred of self, the energy aggression turned inward, where the original actually meant outward, but it couldn't go where it belonged outwardly. Probably was the disappointment in the family, etc. So it learned to go inside, and the destructiveness and self-hatred is what we would want to explore in the therapy and analysis. It would come through dreams, active imagination. Also, it's evident in all relationships. So any transference situation is going to come up with the self-hatred and the singularity, because the singularity is the defense of the self. It's keeping others out, so nobody will interfere. It was the example I gave of Immani, where she had to talk all the time. Nothing allowed, no difference. She and I had to be the same. We're not the same. But that's the eyes that saw and insisted on same. It is not to deny it and say, well, we're not the same. It is more, why is that needed? It's really an awful singularity to defend against. I use this word throughout a bit, to defend against the void. Because the people, as if, or imposter, know there is a part under the whole story they are afraid to go into. Because it holds the unknown. It's probably something to do with the unconscious and material in the unconscious, but it is frightening to these people and they cannot manage it. So it goes cover over, and nobody gets close. What I find also interesting is how, some people do this also, they'll have two therapists, right? Two therapists. I'll tell one here and one here. I don't know how people do that, but they do it, right? Why does the therapist go along with it? That's a whole other story. But it's like going along with the story, right? And it's also saying, if we go along with it, we promote the isolation of singularity. But you see, this is how the person got raised. If you speak to deeply into your background, family, who did you play with even? By myself, in the backyard. My parents were preoccupied. I didn't really have anyone to talk to, no best friend, various things. And the learning is, I'm alone and nobody will help me. And then they carry that through. You can sense it in the transferences. You can sense that person stays away from you. They can only go so close and then somehow shut off. I think if we can notice that in the session and say, where did you go? What happened? Then that brings awareness to the situation. Yeah. I want to emphasize a bit, even in what you said, just a second, which is that narcissism is something that is a piece of this. But narcissism, I'm not saying it negatively. I'm saying it in the sense, like with this personality type, that we want to know what it is representing. There is a wealth of a person in that narcissistic response to life, in the as if and imposter response. There's a whole lot there, and we want to know about it. So I don't say it negatively. I say it's our responsibility to open to the potential that is in the personality. Yeah. And of course, yeah.
Maravilhoso.
Yeah, if you're going to open, you open not just alone, you open with another. So,
Sim,
thank you.
sim. Ô, Lu, eu posso fazer mais uma pergunta?
Pode, vai lá.
Tá. Susan, mais uma questão. Você usou uma expressão que eu achei esplêndida, mas eu nem sei se eu entendi direito o que quer dizer, mas eu adorei e já vou adotar como meu discurso também. Ansiedade arquetípica, né? Me fala um pouco, eu acho que eu entendi dentro do contexto, mas achei a junção muito boa, né? Do que você quis dizer quando você disse sobre a ansiedade arquetípica.
Well, I must say, I like the phrase myself as well, because it represents to me the depth and the seriousness of the anxiety, and really to honor, because an archetype has, right? It's got a spirit and matter, psyche and body. It's got the whole story in it. And there are a wealth of myths, fairy tales, stories, ideas, family stories that reflect the archetypes in many ways. And you could almost, and if those anxieties are so big, they are like archetypes. And as Jung talks about, you don't want to be taken over by an archetype, because then you cannot live. You can't live your individual self because you're living an archetype. If the anxieties are that big, that's what I mean by it. Very large anxieties. Important to look at, but large, and important to take bit by bit by bit, so that they are able to be assimilated and digested. Those anxieties could be transgenerational. They could be family secrets. They could be your own secrets. They could be, on and on and on. The point is, they're huge, they're important to deal with, and not just push aside as, oh, I'm anxious. No, it means more. Take it for its, like it goes everywhere, big. Archetypal anxieties, yes. Not little, big ones. I think we could also say, don't we all live in a world that has a lot of archetypal anxiety in it? I mean, we all do. We live in different cultures, but we all have archetypal anxieties, I think. But yeah, so that's it.
Sim, eu adorei a expressão. E você sabe que assim é muito comum hoje o paciente chegar com essa queixa. Eu vim porque eu estou ansioso, porque eu estou ansiosa, e eu pergunto: e qual é o seu jeito de estar ansioso ou estar ansiosa? porque o paciente já parte do princípio que eu sei o que é estar ansioso. Por isso que eu achei interessante a ansiedade arquetípica, como se houvesse, e de fato há, né, pelo que você está falando, um padrão de ansiedade.
Well, there is a pattern of anxiety. Think about the phrase, history repeats itself. And I also wonder how you all feel about this, but isn't it our responsibility as well that when someone comes in, I'm anxious. Are you anxious about your country? Are you anxious about the world? Are you anxious about climate? Are you anxious so that it becomes not just an I place, but it is I and we are anxious. And there's the archetype of it. It's not uncommon. I'm sure some of you have people who come into your office, they can't have a child because they're worried about the climate, the political climate, the climate, life. They're and those are archetypal anxieties. We all share that. And that's part of the archetype. We all share that level of being anxious. And I think if we bring it out and talk about it, again, it makes so what's personal, what is cultural, what is affecting us, how are we part of the politics of the world? Those are archetypal anxieties. I think that's our responsibility. We're not just there, we're there with that person, but we're really there in a wider way as well. Yeah.
Obrigada, Pati. Obrigada.
Obrigada.
Sua pergunta?
Oi, Susan, tudo bem? Bom te rever novamente, Susan. Sempre bem-vindo te ver aqui, feliz. Segunda vez no Teatros. Seja bem-vinda. Susan, tenho duas questões para você. Uma confusa e uma talvez um pouco menos confusa. Vou começar pela confusa.
Good.
A síndrome do impostor diz respeito, muitas vezes, à ideia de que há algo escondido, há algo que não se revela, há algo que não se mostra. Ok. Nós vivemos numa cultura que é uma cultura onde tudo deve ser mostrado, tudo deve ser visto. É uma cultura da visibilidade, né? Sou visto, logo existo. Estou pensando em mídia social, estou pensando em mídia digital. E estou pensando também, quando eu falo de mídia social, usando uma expressão sua, de um selfie público, de uma persona pública, que está muito misturada hoje com esses ideais postos por essa sociedade, por essa cultura da rede social. Né? Como se deve ter um corpo, como se deve amar, como se deve ser um bom pai, como se deve fazer sexo, como se deve pensar, como se deve ser militante woke ou qualquer coisa dessa ordem. A minha pergunta é, em relação aos ideais, nós não somos sempre impostores? O que eu fiquei pensando? Será que... É isso que eu estou pensando. Em relação aos ideais, nós não somos sempre impostores? Ou seja, desfazer um pouco a síndrome do impostor não é fazer o ideal cair também? Não sei, estou pensando aqui, queria compartilhar e te ouvir um pouco. Faz sentido?
Can I answer this part and then you ask the next? Is that okay? Yeah, okay.
Claro.
Okay. Because I think that we want to see, it's tricky what you said. You're right. Because we want to take ideal and make it real, but we also want to keep on having ideals that fit with who we really are, fit with who our real self is. So we could use, and I spoke of social media a lot as well, we could use that in an honest way. We can use it to reflect and show not just, what we ate for breakfast or something, but really things that are of value to ourselves. And we can connect with other people in a very real way. I think that is my question to you, back to you again, which is, don't we want to have some ideals, not unrealistic ideals, but ideals that keep us going, give us life and vitality, and that they are not unrealistic, but we are moving towards something which we don't really know where we will go, but it is important. I'm going to make an analogy, see if this is right. So when you began Thyasos, it was maybe an ideal, and it has become so real, and it became something, I'm sure, who knew what it would evolve into. And so having the idea and the ideal blossomed into what it is. And hopefully it will keep going. So that would be my answer to the real and the ideal. To keep it grounded, that's a challenge. Within the place that we accept who we really are, who we are. Yeah. And you had another question. Yeah.
Eu só quero complementar essa tua resposta com um exemplo do Tiaços. O ideal mítico, o ideal divino, seria como nós começamos o Tiaços, fazendo um encontro por semana, durante meses. E descobrimos que isso teve um fôlego, mas depois não dá para sustentar. Hoje nós fazemos um Tiaços quinzenalmente, uma vez por mês. O ideal se mantém, mas a Luciana é o ideal do 15 em 15 dias. Eu sou o ideal de toda semana. Então é uma constante tensão entre nós dois. Mas aí eu te digo, a ideia, eu concordo, manter ideais, mas ideais talvez não tão limpos, não tão claros, ideais um pouco mais sujos, ideais um pouco mais, Isa, não sei se é essa palavra, amarrotados, um pouco mais possíveis, ideais um pouco mais possíveis. Se esses ideais mais possíveis não teriam efeito na sensação de ser impostor.
But you see the issue, and I'm sorry, I said the name Thyasos with an American accent, not as Portuguese, so my apologies. However, I think that what you describe in your way of saying it is flexible. The imposter and the as-if personality are too rigid. They do not do flexible. And the openness of flexibility makes things real and more able to live. You can't live rigid. It limits life. And what you're saying is to propel life, it has to be movable, it has to be transient, it has to have a flow, and it has a collaborative nature to it. All things that seem threatening to the as-if personality and the imposter. So.
Perfeito, concordo. Obrigado, Suza.
Welcome.
E a outra? Tinha mais uma, Marco?
Não, acho que essa me responde.
Fechou? Tá bom. Mais alguma pergunta, pessoal? Se não tiver mais nenhuma, eu vou fazer a última aqui. Como estão? Susan, me conta uma coisa, tem alguma ligação entre esses dois livros? Surgiu a ideia a partir desse? Me conta.
Yes, there is a connection, and in the next books that I'm writing as well, they all connect. They all connect. So, on the first one, on the absent father effect on daughters, I had a part on the as-if personality. So I expanded it. Here's life, hopefully. I expanded it into the second one. And how did they evolve? They evolved together, actually. They evolved several years ago from the absent father, and that effect, I didn't have time to go into the father effect on Immani, but you can imagine the father was not a related father, distant, and the stepfather was awful. He hit her, he was mean. So emotionally absent father affected the daughter to develop the impostor syndrome, as-if personality, and really a frozenness to her body. So are they connected? Yes, they were very connected. And if we all think about our patterns and our themes inside of ourselves, they have a connection. It's the process of being who we are. So who we are has this part, this part, this part, this part, and they all need to connect. It's like the red thread of our being goes throughout. And so, of course, there's a connection. I'm glad that you suggested that question because it's true. Yes, yes. Does anyone have another question?
A Ana Cristina, novamente, acho que quer complementar aqui. Vai lá, Ana.
Oi, gente, vou de novo. Não, é porque essa coisa do pai, eu até comprei o livro, mas ainda não chegou. Mas aí esse pai é o pai gênero, não, é o pai sendo um princípio masculino na educação da menina, da mulher. Ou é esse, porque hoje a gente tem uma sociedade que tem várias conformações familiares. A gente tem 2 homens, 2 mulheres maternando, paternando, enfim. Então, quando você fala pai, e quando você traz aqui agora, não é essa imagem que a gente está acostumada tradicionalmente, mas eu posso entender pai como o princípio masculino, porque tem as tais mulheres fálicas, que a gente fala de famílias de mulheres fortes, que são as que vão para o mundo. E aí me ocorreu isso agora. Você poderia dar uma explicadinha, por favor? Obrigada.
I think that our definitions of what is fathering and what is mothering are altering, moving, changing with our cultures that are altering, moving, and changing. And I think that whoever takes the father role, however we're going to define that, I don't really define it actually, because I think we don't want to be in too many stereotypes. But I think that the father position as one who is related honors the being and the body of the child, will help that child become real, feel safe in the world, and able to express themselves. So the father, I'm not saying that the mothering role doesn't do the same. It does in kind of different ways, because we still are kind of stuck in old stereotypes that are constantly changing and moving. You know, they're like a a ball that goes around like this, and the definitions are moving, 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 and we all are challenged to move with them or put our input there. The difficulty with the as if person is, or the imposter, if you're afraid, how movable are you going to be? If you are vulnerable, you might abuse your role as a parent. If you are threatened by your children's talents and abilities, you won't be able to help them blossom into all that they are. So I'm glad that you said that, because I've tried to stay away from the stereotypes. It makes it difficult, but we're all in flux. So if we are in flux, maybe we are all growing. Yeah.
Gente, muito obrigada. Muito obrigada pela presença de vocês. Susan, super obrigada por ter vindo novamente, pela apresentação, pelas respostas. Fica à vontade para falar o que você quiser. Se quiser falar mais alguma coisa, por favor.
May I just close with one last quote? I know I overload with the quotes, but they're gorgeous. Just with this one last quote. And then I also want to thank you all for your attention and contribution. It's very valuable to me, so thank you. So here's the quote, and this is from Michel Foucault, who was a French philosopher in the 20th century. From the idea that the self is not given to us, I think there is only one practical consequence. We have to create ourselves as a work of art. So thank you.
Maravilhoso.
Thank you.
Muito
Thank you.
obrigada. Susan, já ouvi que tem aí um terceiro caminho. Sinta-se já convidada para apresentá-lo. Antes mesmo de se inscrever, você já está convidada a apresentá-lo aqui. Você é sempre muito bem-vinda. Obrigada, pessoal.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Have a wonderful day. Thank
Foi
you.
maravilhoso.
Bye.
Olha, então a gente volta, pessoal, no dia 8 de março, com o Raul Barreto, que vai falar sobre masculinidades em movimento, arte, pertencimento e transformação nos slams e saraus de poesia. Vejo vocês.
Obrigada, Lu.
Obrigada, gente. Obrigada, Suzy.
Beijo.
Bye. Bye.